It wasn't war that took everything away overnight. No invasion, no sirens, just a sudden gut-wrenching collapse that wiped out $200 billion. In a blink, people who'd gone to sleep wealthy woke up flat broke. America plunged headfirst into a decade of hunger, dust storms, and broken dreams. So how did this happen? Let's take a step back to the roaring days before the nightmare. Picture 1922. The First World War is finally behind us, and the men's mustaches are as absurd as the optimism in the air. Factories stopped churning out weapons and switched to toasters and vacuum cleaners. And refrigerators so slick they scoffed at old-fashioned ice boxes. New York's skyline sprouted skyscrapers like weeds after a storm. Jazz music flowed everywhere, like the invisible soundtrack of a decade that no one quite knew how to handle. The economy wasn't just good, it was on fire. Industries hummed with life. Henry Ford's moving assembly line slashed car production from 12 hours to 90 minutes. And suddenly Model Ts flooded the streets. Oil, steel, rubber, everything connected gleefully in a chain reaction of growth. America wasn't just growing, it was roaring full throttle. Electric lights brightened cities, luxury gadgets found their way into homes. 10 million American households had radios by 1929, filling rooms with voices and music that felt almost magical, as if radios were some secret society's language. But while the big cities partied hard, rural America was barely holding on. Farmers, once flush from wartime demand, were drowning in falling crop prices. They took out loans to buy shiny tractors, hoping for salvation. Instead, they just found faster ways to run into debt. Meanwhile, urban Americans discovered their new obsession: buy now, pay later. Radios, cars, stocks, finance it all. Banks, thrilled by the flood of installment plans, handed out credit like candy to anyone with a heartbeat. It was the financial equivalent of crash dating. Sure, I'll marry you, we've gone out twice. No one cared about foundations or stability because everyone believed prices could only go up. Now Wall Street lit up like the ultimate Disneyland for grown-ups. Margin loans let people buy $100 worth of stock, with only $10 down, borrowing the rest with wild confidence. A wild confidence in endless growth. Barbers, butchers, even bellboys started doling out investment tips like gospel. The Dow Jones quadrupled between 1924 and 1929, soaring far beyond what any company's actual value justified. It was a party without parents, and nobody wanted to be the one to call it off. This wasn't just reckless fun, it was an entire nation building castles on quicksand, convinced the ground beneath them was solid gold. The fragile truth: all this so-called wealth was a house of cards, masking a devastating decay that would soon come crushing down. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Everyone was told their money was safe, completely safe, they said. But that wasn't true, far from it. Entire families watched their life savings evaporate. Grandparents who had spent decades building a nest egg saw it wiped out overnight. Middle-class workers who had stashed away cash for their children's college tuition found nothing left but numbers on a page. Real homes, tangible assets, hard-earned financial security, gone in a blink. Marriage rates plummeted as economic despair settled in. Birth rates followed suit because when the future feels uncertain, people stop planning for it. Breadwinners lost their jobs and then their self-worth. The optimism that had fueled a decade vanished, replaced by fear and an almost tangible hopelessness. The great roaring 20s ended not with a bang but a slow, suffocating choke. Let's break down what really happened in the harshest terms. During the boom, people bought stocks on margin, putting down $10 and borrowing $90 to control $100 worth of shares. It was a brilliant leverage play until the market turned. Suddenly, brokers demanded immediate repayment of that borrowed $90. The collateral vanished like smoke, leaving investors liable for debts they could never cover. Rich men on Monday were destitute by Thursday. Banks, long thought unshakable pillars of trust, collapsed like a house of cards. They'd lent money against these inflated assets and had no way to recover loans when prices cratered. What followed were bank runs, crowds banging on locked doors, screams for savings that weren't there. Tellers tried in vain to calm the hysteria, while balance sheets turned into Greek riddles. The financial system wasn't broken, it was never solid to begin with. This wasn't some abstract economic failure, it was people losing homes, jobs, futures. It was entire communities stripped of financial lifeblood. The cold math is brutal, over 200 billion in today's dollars. Wealth lost, real wealth, not monopoly money. This devastation was so sudden, so total, it left an economy gasping for air, and millions scrambling to salvage some semblance of stability. So next time you hear about safe investments or steadfast banks, remember that historical reckoning. Numbers and percentages on a ticker tape don't tell the full story. Behind each one lies a family, a dream, a life. The lesson is harsh but clear. When the financial game is built on hype and blind optimism, the crash isn't a question of if, but when. And when it hits, the fallout is far more than digits disappearing on a screen. When the crash hit, it wasn't just numbers fading away on a screen. Entire families found their world shattered. Grandpa's bonds, once thought invincible, turned to dust. Aunt Margaret's lifelong savings vanished overnight. Little Timmy's piggy bank remained untouched, not because of fortune, but because no one had the heart to explain it to the youngest, that he was now the richest person alive simply by comparison. This collapse didn't stop at America's borders. Panic spread like wildfire. U.S. banks, desperate to cover their own losses, recalled loans from overseas. Europe, still barely holding itself together, was thrust into chaos. Germany's tentative recovery crumbled, Britain staggered and nearly folded. The arteries of international commerce, once flowing strong, were choked off, and reduced to half their former volume, all within 3 brutal years. Yet, amid this upheaval, denial clung stubbornly to the surface. Newspapers splashed optimistic headlines assuring everyone that the market was simply adjusting, and investors were merely taking profits. Meanwhile, just below those bright promises, a photo told a far bleaker story: a man pawning his wedding ring just to buy a loaf of bread. Politicians offered rehearsed reassurances, bankers flashed nervous smiles on radio broadcasts. Delivering scripted calm, "We're totally fine, nothing to worry about." President Herbert Hoover's steady voice echoed through radios, insisting that the economy remained fundamentally sound. But thousands of Americans sat at empty dinner tables, staring into nothingness, wrestling silently with the bitter truth that none of these words filled their stomachs or paid their bills. The system dragged on, broken and aimless, pretending the crash was a bump in the road rather than a deepening abyss. The real fall had only just begun. By 1931, the music had stopped, the lights had been switched off. The party was undeniably over. Yet what followed was not quiet. It was the deafening roar of factories grinding to a halt. Fathers whispered apologies they never imagined having to say. America exhaled, but found nothing left to breathe. The unemployment rate soared to 25%. 1 in every 4 Americans willing and able to work was left idle. Jobs evaporated like smoke. Detroit saw its automobile plants shutter one by one. Production fell by a staggering 75%. The machines that once symbolized progress stood still, dark and silent. Men who had built the American dream found themselves stranded outside factory gates, waiting for something, anything, but knowing not what. City streets sagged under the heavy weight of need. Bread lines stretched like quiet serpents through downtowns. Mothers lined up at dawn for a thin bowl of soup. Children, too young to understand the grinding hardship, watched breakfast slip away like a fading memory. Teachers reported students fainting not from boredom, but from hunger after days without food. America wasn't starving in the literal sense, but it was starving in every other way that mattered. Desperation seeped into homes, once full of laughter, now thick with silence. Banks had failed, savings accounts held nothing but ghosts. Dignity was fraying thread by thread. Suicide rates climbed, dragging despair into countless households. Newspapers abandoned printing obituaries; they simply couldn't keep pace with the mounting death toll. Behind every cold statistic was a real person, a family, dreams destroyed. People who once believed their country would protect them now found that faith cruelly betrayed. Weddings were canceled, marriages abandoned. Birth rates dropped as the future became something people no longer dared to imagine. And still, who was to blame? Who was standing at the helm when the storm struck? who truly owned the assets that were being methodically stripped away. The narrative sold to the suffering masked a darker reality. The system's gears were turning hard, only to fill the pockets of a few. The ones placed to protect the public's wealth were quietly watching it erode, if not helping it slip through their fingers altogether. This value wasn't disappearing into thin air, it was being transferred, layered, and concentrated. Even as the masses were pushed out onto the figurative and literal streets, they were part of a systematic extraction, making clear who was losing and gaining. The illusion of effort and merit faded fast. Once the ownership behind the scenes was brought into focus, is it any wonder people stopped dreaming of weddings and children, when just securing a meal became an impossible challenge? And if the system was so opaque, so remorseless, who could guide a broken nation out of the wreckage? By March, the silence was deafening, but underneath it, the fight for survival had only just begun. What we must ask next is not how deep this hole goes, but who benefits while millions flounder at the bottom. Because understanding that is the key to ever reclaiming what was lost. So tell me, what do you think? 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped up to the podium, the weight of a battered nation pressing down on his shoulders. Millions leaned in, desperate for something, anything that could break the cycle of despair. The air was thick with unease. The crash had already erased trillions in today's dollars. But the damage wasn't just financial. It carved deep into the fabric of families, communities, entire ways of life. Outside the capitals and ballrooms, the reality was pounding harder than ever. Years of reckless overfarming had left the Great Plains with soil stripped bare. When the rain stopped, fissures cracked the earth. But worse was coming. Gigantic dust storms, so thick and black they blotted out the sun. They thundered across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. Dust piled into homes like snowdrifts, suffocating livestock, killing crops, turning breathing into a struggle. Families coughed through nights coated in the very earth that once fed them. Desperation pushed millions westward, piled into dilapidated cars, chasing faint whispers of work and hope in California. But California or bust was often just bust. The hunger went beyond empty stomachs. It was a hunger for security, for dignity. In Washington, President Hoover clung to a brittle optimism. Volunteer efforts here, a patchwork relief program there. The Hoover Dam rose as a concrete monument to progress, yet it was powerless to fill empty bellies or shelter the homeless. His refusal to embrace large-scale federal aid turned his name into a bitter punchline. Hoovervilles sprang up, shanty towns of trash and cardboard. Hoover blankets were newspapers pressed over shivering bodies. Hoover flags were the sight of empty pockets turned inside out. Then summer 1932 came like a breaking point. Thousands of World War I veterans, beaten down by years of broken promises. They marched on Washington demanding their bonuses early. They pitched tents outside the Capitol and waited, hopeful but weary. Congress refused, Hoover refused, and then the unimaginable happened. The army was sent in. Tear gas fired on men who had fought for their country. Camps burned to ashes, families scattered in smoke and fear. Americans watched, stunned and disbelieving, as their own government turned weapons onto its heroes. The fallout wasn't just political, it was cultural and emotional. Radical ideas, once fringe, spread like wildfire. Socialist rallies and communist recruitment, born not from conviction, but from starvation and betrayal. Crime soared. Bank robbers like Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde became folk legends. Symbols of revolt against a system that had left millions with nothing. America's greatness wasn't just bankrupt, it was broken at its core. And yet, in all this ruin, something stubborn remained. Not hope exactly, but a bare-bones endurance. People didn't surrender because they believed the nightmare would end tomorrow. They survived because there was no alternative. They moved, lined up in breadlines, held tight to the family scraps left to them. But here was the brutal question hanging over everything. In a country that once promised infinite growth, what do you hold on to when the growth stops? Who has the power to pull the nation out of the wreckage? When the faith itself is shattered. We're not talking grand plans or sweeping reforms here. The task now is simpler. Identify the one small, almost mechanical action that shatters old patterns. A tiny pivot anyone can make, no grand promises or visions. Just something concrete and immediate that interrupts the cycle holding you hostage. Because that's how change starts, not with a revolution in the headlines, but with an act barely noticeable on its own, yet powerful enough to break the chain. What's yours? What's step one to slicing through the old way of thinking, the old suffering? Think about it, because while the world watched Roosevelt speak, while promises were made to rebuild a broken nation, the real recovery demanded small, deliberate, relentless action. What's your first move? The story of recovery isn't one of sudden jackpots or overnight fortunes. It's a careful, painstaking rebuilding process, rooted in realistic, incremental progress rather than dazzling promises. Roosevelt's New Deal broke the cycle of despair not with magic, but by laying down a framework for steady, manageable growth, rules to prevent Wall Street's reckless excess, safety nets to ease the crushing anxiety of old age and job loss, and real employment programs that put hands to honest work. Imagine standing on a construction scaffold, muscles aching after a long day of raising steel beams. You're not suddenly rich, but you're earning a wage. You can feed your family, and crucially, you're part of a bigger plan to rebuild a fractured nation. This spirit of persistence replaces the illusion of quick riches with something far sturdier, hope grounded in collective action and institutional reform. The pledge here is not that you'll get rich fast. No one promised instant wealth. What was promised and delivered was the chance to survive, to keep going when the odds felt stacked against you. That survival buffer matters more than flashy gains. It buys you time, dignity, and the ability to reclaim your future bit by bit. And that's the real lesson for us today. Forget the fantasies of overnight riches or market miracles. Real recovery, real compounding gains come from steady, consistent effort, from rules that protect rather than exploit, and from knowing when to hold tight and when to move deliberately. Every small step forward, a paycheck, a new job, a rebuilt dam lighting up a dark town, compounds into something lasting. So what's the first step for you now? It's not a secret hack, a winning lottery ticket, or a social media scheme promising untold riches overnight. It's accepting a simple, tough truth: wealth built fast often disappears fast. How will you start building your buffer against tomorrow's uncertainties? What small, steady action can you take today that compounds quietly but surely over time? Share your thoughts. What does real, sustainable growth mean for you? In a world where the only guaranteed rule is resilience?